"Sir, my mama says kindness never goes to waste, so why did you throw hers away?" That question stopped a billionaire's heart. For the first time in years, a single sentence from a little girl would undo everything he believed about power, respect, and success. He had fired a maid without mercy, not knowing that years ago that same woman had saved the most precious life he ever had. This is the story of how one small voice changed the heart of a man who thought he had everything. "Elena, where's my coffee?" The words sliced through the silence like a blade. Richard Hale's voice carried weight, not because it was loud, but because it didn't have to be. It had the kind of authority that turned rooms quiet, that made even the ticking of the clock sound like an interruption. His tone was sharp, cold, and precise, the kind of tone used by a man who was used to being obeyed instantly. The dining hall of the Hale mansion stretched long and glittering under the morning light. Chandeliers shimmered above, their golden arms scattering fragments of light across the polished table. Every inch of the room spoke of control. The marble floors, the white drapes, the carefully folded napkins. It was the kind of perfection that didn't allow space for mistakes or mercy. On the table before him lay a breakfast that looked almost staged. Freshly baked croissants arranged in a perfect spiral, a bowl of fruit gleaming like colored glass. The butter softened to the exact degree of spreadability. Only one thing was missing, the one thing that Richard demanded at exactly 7 every morning. His black coffee. Across the hall, Elena froze. The silver tray in her hands trembled so slightly that even the light caught its shaking reflection. Her heart pounded hard enough to echo in her ears. She had served this house for 5 long years, years of early mornings, late nights, and silent obedience. And yet, that single missing cup felt like the end of everything. I'm sorry, sir," she managed, her voice small, almost swallowed by the vastness of the hall. "I just stepped into the kitchen to—" "You forgot," he interrupted, his tone cutting her apology short. You had one simple task. The air between them tightened. You could feel the humiliation bloom in the silence. The other servants in the room suddenly found reasons to look away, pretending to polish the silver, or to adjust a vase that didn't need adjusting. Elena's hands trembled. "It won't happen again, sir. Please, I've worked here for 5 years. But before she could finish, Richard's reply landed like a hammer. "And 5 years should have taught you better." His words were ice. There was no anger in them, only disappointment, the kind that cuts deeper because it's calm. Then came the final sentence, cold, final, unforgiving. "You're dismissed." "Pack your things." For a long second, nothing moved. Not even the air. Elena's eyes widened, not in disbelief, but in heartbreak. This house had been her second home, its people her second family. Every corner of this mansion carried the echo of her footsteps, the touch of her care. And now it was over a cup of coffee. "Sir, please," she whispered, her voice breaking. "I have a daughter." But Richard turned his gaze toward the window, unmoved. "Then maybe," he said, his voice low and firm, "teach her to value discipline. I don't reward carelessness." Those words, cruel, unnecessary, final, hit her like a slap. Not because of their tone, but because of their truth, in his world. To him, rules mattered more than people. Mistakes were not lessons, they were crimes. The silence that followed was unbearable. The ticking of the grandfather clock filled the room, each second marking the distance between 2 lives that would never meet again. Elena swallowed hard, forcing herself to stand straight. She wanted to speak, to tell him that she hadn't forgotten, that she had only gone to make sure his coffee was the perfect temperature, that she had done her job with love and care for years. But she knew it wouldn't matter. People like her didn't get explanations, only orders. So she nodded slowly. "Yes, sir," she said softly, her voice steady despite the tears threatening to fall. "Thank you for the opportunity." She turned and began to walk away. Her footsteps were quiet but heavy, the kind that echo inside a heart long after they fade from the air. No one stopped her. No one dared. The other servants stood still, heads down, trapped between pity and fear. Richard remained where he was, adjusting his cufflinks, pretending not to care. But somewhere deep inside, under layers of pride and routine, a small discomfort stirred, the kind of feeling a man feels when something human tries to wake him. Elena reached the main door, her reflection flickering on the polished marble floor. Outside, the sky was dark with the promise of rain. As she stepped through the grand archway for what might be the last time, the first drops began to fall, and soft, cold, and relentless. Her shoes left small, wet prints on the marble steps. But as the rain poured harder, those prints began to fade, erased, as if she had never been there at all. She didn't cry. She didn't beg again. She just walked, her uniform damp, her hair sticking to her face, her heart pounding with a quiet kind of pain that only those who've been humiliated in silence understand. Behind her, the mansion glowed warm and golden through the rain, like a world she no longer belonged to. And though she didn't know it yet, that single moment, that dismissal, that humiliation would become the spark that would change not only her life, but the life of the man who had just turned his back on her. For in that house of luxury and pride, Richard Hale believed he had ended a small mistake. He didn't realize that he had just begun the greatest lesson of his life. The rain hadn't stopped since morning. It was one of those long, cold rains that seemed to soak through more than just clothes, the kind that crept into hearts. Hours had passed since Elena had walked out of the mansion gates, her steps swallowed by the storm. Inside, life went on as usual, polished floors, quiet servants, and a man who believed the world outside his gates didn't matter. But outside those gates, something small, fragile, and pure was about to arrive. A tiny figure appeared through the mist of falling rain. She was so small that her umbrella, broken at one side, tilted awkwardly in the wind, barely shielding her from the downpour. Her little shoes squelched in the mud, each step leaving faint marks that the rain quickly erased. Her name was Lila, 7 years old, a child with eyes too bright for such a gray day. Every afternoon, like clockwork, she came to these gates, not to enter, but just to see her mother smile through the bars, even for a few seconds. For her, that tiny moment was enough to make the whole day beautiful. But today felt different. The guards at the mansion gate looked uneasy as they saw her approach. They exchanged glances, their expressions unsure, as if the innocent standing before them didn't belong in a place this cold and ordered. "Excuse me, mister," she said softly, clutching her umbrella handle with both hands. Her voice was gentle, sweet, filled with the kind of trust only children carry. "I'm here for my mama." The older guard, a man with tired eyes who had seen far too much rain and regret, knelt slightly, lowering his voice. "What's your mama's name, sweetheart?" "Elena," she replied proudly, her small lips curving into a smile. "She works here. She said she makes everything clean and pretty." The man's throat tightened. He looked at his fellow guard, then back at her. "Sweetheart, your mama isn't working here anymore. For a second." The words hung in the air, and too heavy, too big for her little world. Lila blinked, the confusion in her eyes growing like storm clouds. "Not working?" she asked, her voice small, unsure. "But she said she loves her job." The guard hesitated. "How do you explain cruelty to a child?" He forced a gentle tone. She went home early, little one. Maybe you should wait there, by the road." "It's raining bad today." Lila frowned, but didn't argue. She was taught to listen, to be polite. Her mama always said that kindness was the only thing they could afford every day. So she nodded and stepped back, holding her umbrella tightly against the wind. The rain fell harder now, its rhythm almost matching the beating of her small heart. She waited quietly, water dripping from her sleeves, shoes soaked through, her school bag pressed to her chest like it held all her courage. And then she saw her. Through the mist, at the top of the marble steps, stood her mother, apron folded neatly in her arms, shoulders heavy with exhaustion. For a moment, Lila thought she must be dreaming. Her mama never came out this early. "Mama!" she cried out, voice cracking with relief. Her tiny feet splashed through puddles as she ran, her umbrella flying out of her hand, tumbling away into the wind. Elena saw her, that small burst of life running toward her, and dropped everything she was holding. She knelt down, arms wide open, catching her daughter in a hug that was half relief. Half heartbreak, the kind of hug that says everything words can't. Lila buried her face in her mother's coat, breathing in the faint smell of soap and rain. "What happened, Mama?" she asked, voice trembling. "Why are you leaving early?" Elena hesitated. The words caught in her throat. How do you explain to a child that someone took away your dignity over a cup of coffee? How do you tell her that kindness doesn't always come back to you? So she smiled, a soft, tired smile that only mothers can give when they're breaking inside. "Nothing, baby," she whispered, brushing a wet strand of hair from Lila's face. "We're just going home early today." But Lila wasn't satisfied. "Did the boss man get mad?" she asked innocently. Elena froze for a moment, then forced another gentle smile. "Sometimes," she said softly, "people forget how to be kind." The rain continued to fall, tracing rivers down their faces. Lila didn't fully understand, but she could feel it, the heaviness in her mother's arms, the sadness in her smile. And yet she didn't cry. She simply held her tighter. Together, they began to walk away from the towering mansion, a mother and daughter wrapped in one small umbrella that barely held against the wind. The road ahead was muddy, uneven, and cold. But Elena's steps were steady. She had been through worse, and Lila's hand in hers felt like the only warmth she needed. Behind them, the mansion loomed large, silent and indifferent, its windows reflecting the rain like tears it refused to shed. Inside, Richard Hale probably sat by his desk, his coffee steaming perfectly beside him. The same coffee that had cost a woman her job, her pride, her sense of belonging. He didn't know that, outside his walls, that decision had changed everything, not just for Elena, but for the child now walking through the storm. The rain thickened, falling in endless sheets, but neither of them stopped. Layla began to hum softly, a tune her mother used to sing while working, something about hope and sunshine after rain. Her voice was faint but steady, a small sound fighting against the roar of the storm. Elena listened, her eyes stinging. She didn't cry, but every note pierced something inside her. She thought of the years she had given to that house, the mornings she woke before dawn to make sure everything was perfect. And for what? A single mistake, or perhaps not even a mistake, just a moment of human imperfection, had cost her everything. Yet when she looked down at her daughter, she realized something else. They still had each other, and that somehow was more than what money or power could ever buy. By the time they reached the end of the road, the storm had softened to a drizzle. Leela looked up and smiled, that same radiant smile that could warm any heart, except perhaps the one locked behind the mansion's golden gates. Elena squeezed her hand gently. "Come on, baby," she whispered. "Let's go home." Together they disappeared into the gray of the city, two silhouettes blending into the rain, walking away from a world that had forgotten compassion. The puddles reflected their small figures, rippling softly with each step. The rain, the road, the silence, all of it felt like the beginning of something. Something bigger than a job lost, for fate has strange ways of turning pain into purpose, and though neither mother nor daughter could know it yet, their story wasn't ending that day. It was just beginning. The rain had thinned to a drizzle, but the world still looked gray, a colorless stretch of road, puddles rippling beneath passing cars, and two figures walking side by side, holding each other's warmth against the cold wind. Elena's shoes were soaked through, every step squished softly against the wet pavement. Her old coat clung to her like a second skin, heavy with rain and worry. Yet her hand never once loosened its grip on her daughter's. For Lila, the world was simple. She was with her mama, and that was enough. She didn't understand what fired meant, not really. All she knew was that her mother's eyes looked sad, and that the big house behind them had somehow stolen her smile. The traffic whooshed by, water splashing up in waves. The smell of wet asphalt and exhaust filled the air, and then, from behind them, came the low hum of an engine that sounded too smooth, too polished to belong to this part of town. A sleek black car slowed down beside them, its tires whispering against the wet road. The back window rolled down, and a familiar voice, deep, commanding, cold, cut through the sound of the rain. "You shouldn't be walking in this weather." Elena froze. She didn't need to look. She knew that voice, the voice that had just turned her world upside down that morning. The man who saw her worth measured only in mistakes. She turned slightly, her face calm but drained of color. "It's all we can afford, sir." Her tone was polite, but every syllable carried the weight of quiet dignity, the kind that refuses to break, even when humiliated. Richard Hale sat inside his luxury car, the leather interior untouched by the outside world. Through the open window, the rain smelled faintly of iron and earth, a smell he hadn't noticed in years. For a brief moment, the billionaire looked uncomfortable. The woman before him, wet, weary, yet unbowed, was not the maid he dismissed earlier. She looked like something else entirely, human. And then from beside her came a small, trembling voice. "Are you the boss man?" Richard blinked, lowering his gaze. Standing there, half hidden behind her mother's coat, was a little girl, no more than 7, her hair plastered to her forehead by rain, her eyes wide and curious. "Yes," Richard replied slowly, unsure how to respond to the innocence looking back at him. Lila took a small step forward, her voice barely above a whisper. "Then, can you make a new rule?" Richard frowned. "A new rule?" "A rule that says kind people don't lose their jobs for small mistakes." The words hit harder than he expected. They were soft, childlike, yet somehow sharper than truth. Richard's hand tightened slightly on the steering wheel. No one had ever spoken to him like that. Not investors, not employees, not even friends. And yet here stood a child shivering in the rain asking for something simple, something fair. For a moment he didn't know what to say. The weight of silence pressed against the air between them. His instinct told him to end the conversation, to roll up the window, to drive away. That was easier, safer. But something in her eyes stopped him. They weren't pleading. They weren't angry. They were true. Lila swallowed hard, her small voice trembling. "My mama's a good person," she said softly. "She always helps people, even when no one helps her." Helena's heart clenched. She squeezed Lila's hand gently, trying to hush her, but the words had already reached where they were meant to go. Richard looked away, pretending to check his watch, but inside something stirred. Something he hadn't felt in years. He cleared his throat. "Trying to sound composed, little girl," he said evenly. "Life doesn't work like that." Lila tilted her head, her brows furrowing in quiet confusion. "It should." That single word, should, lingered in the air like a truth too heavy to ignore. For a second, even the rain seemed to pause as if listening. Richard blinked, unsure why his chest suddenly felt heavy. It was ridiculous, he thought. She was just a child, a wet, stubborn little girl who didn't understand how the world worked. And yet, for the first time in years, he felt seen. Not as the billionaire, not as the man in control, but as someone capable of being wrong. Helena tugged gently at her daughter's hand. "Come, Lila," she whispered. "We should go." Lila nodded reluctantly, but before turning away, she looked back at Richard one last time. Her expression wasn't angry. It wasn't even sad. It was hopeful, the kind of look that believes people can still change. Richard sat there, frozen. The window was still open, the rain tapping softly on the edge of the car door. He watched them walk away, the mother's figure slightly hunched from the cold, the child's steps light but steady beside her. They looked so small against the wide gray world, so fragile, and yet so unbreakable. His driver glanced in the rearview mirror, waiting for a command, but Richard didn't speak. He just stared ahead, his thoughts louder than the rain. Something in him twisted uncomfortably. Guilt? Regret? He didn't know. All he knew was that her words, "it should," wouldn't leave his mind. As the car idled, a memory flickered, faint, buried deep in time. A boy, much younger, standing beside his father on a rainy day, just like this one. His father scolding a servant for being late. The servant had a son, about Layla's age, standing silently by the gate. The father's voice thundered. The boy's eyes had filled with tears, and young Richard had looked away then, pretending it didn't bother him. But it had. It always had. And now, years later, history was repeating itself. Only this time, he was the man behind the cruelty. He blinked hard, pushing the memory away. "Let's go," he said quietly. The driver nodded, putting the car in motion. But as they drove off, Richard looked through the rear window and saw them still walking, side by side, their umbrella tilted against the drizzle. They didn't stop, didn't look back, didn't wait for pity, just a mother and daughter moving forward, holding on to dignity that no one could fire them from. The city swallowed them slowly, two silhouettes fading into the rain, their reflections stretching long and fragile on the wet road, and Richard felt something strange. Emptiness, the kind that no wealth could fill. He leaned back, closing his eyes briefly. Lila's voice echoed in his mind, soft, persistent, impossible to ignore. It should. That night he would try to forget. He would pour himself another drink, read another report, convince himself he had done nothing wrong, but deep down, a small voice, her voice, would whisper again, a rule that says, kind people don't lose their jobs for small mistakes. And somewhere, buried under years of pride and perfection, a heart that had long gone quiet, stirred awake. That night the mansion was quieter than usual. The sound of rain had softened. But the silence inside those marble halls felt heavier than thunder. Every clock ticked a little slower. Every echo lingered a little longer, as if even the walls were holding their breath. In the kitchen, a few of the staff lingered after hours. They spoke in hushed voices, their words carried by the dim glow of a single hanging bulb. The smell of soap and coffee still hung in the air, a cruel reminder of the moment that had cost Elena her job. He fired her for coffee? One of the maids whispered, shaking her head in disbelief. Over a cup? You know how he is, another replied bitterly. No one's safe here. One mistake, and you're gone. But she's been here for years, said a young footman, his voice trembling. She trained half of us. Everyone loves her. The room went still for a moment, that uncomfortable kind of silence when truth is spoken too loudly. A third voice, older and wearier, cut through the whispers. He doesn't care, it said. The words came from Mrs. Green, the head housekeeper, a woman who had worked in that mansion since before Richard's fortune had even taken root. Her hair had turned gray over the years, but her posture remained proud, disciplined, yet tonight her voice was softer, more human than usual. People are numbers to him, she murmured, and numbers don't bleed. Her words hung in the air like a slow, painful truth. No one argued. They couldn't. They had seen it too many times. A man who demanded perfection, but had forgotten what kindness looked like. But as the others shook their heads and returned to scrubbing dishes, Mrs. Green stayed behind. She sat at the long wooden table, her hands resting in her lap, eyes distant. The faint hum of the refrigerator filled the silence, mixing with the rhythmic drip of rain outside the back door. Her thoughts drifted far from that kitchen, back to a spring day many years ago, when laughter still echoed through these walls, and the man upstairs had still been capable of smiling. Back to the day of the lake picnic. It had been a rare day off, one of those sunny afternoons when even the wealthy allowed themselves to pretend they were ordinary. The gardens were alive with color, children's laughter floating across the manicured lawns. Richard's daughter, Clara, only 4 years old then, had been the heart of that happiness, a tiny whirlwind of curls and giggles. She had been chasing a butterfly near the lake, her small hands clapping in delight, her shoes slipping on the damp grass. Careful, sweetheart. Someone had called, but it was too late. A single misstep, a splash, and the world had changed in an instant. The lake was deeper than it looked. The water, still cold from winter, swallowed her tiny frame before anyone could react. Screams echoed across the garden. The maids dropped their trays, the guards rushed forward, but panic froze them all. No one knew what to do. No one, except one woman. Mrs. Green could still see it clearly, that blur of motion, that desperate courage. A young maid, her uniform soaked in seconds, had run straight into the water without hesitation. She didn't think of her dress, her shoes, her fear. She only thought of the child. Helena! Mrs. Green had cried out, but by then the girl was already waist-deep, reaching through the rippling surface, calling out the child's name. The crowd had stood frozen, useless, their gasps mixing with the sound of splashing. Seconds felt like hours. Then, finally, a small head broke the surface, followed by Elena's trembling arms. She clutched Clara tightly, coughing, shivering, her lips blue from the cold. The gardener had waded in to help them both out, and as they stumbled back onto the grass, the crowd erupted in relief. Clara was alive, shaken but breathing, and Elena, shaking violently, had knelt beside her, wrapping her in her own shawl before collapsing from exhaustion. Richard had been there too, silent and pale. He had held his daughter, whispered her name again and again. But in the panic, he had barely noticed the maid who had risked her life for her. It was Mrs. Green who had tended to Elena afterward, wrapping her in blankets and making sure she was cared for. When Richard finally came to thank her, days later, it was brief, polite, distant, businesslike, and that was the last time the incident was ever spoken of. Mrs. Green's lips trembled as the memory faded. She looked around the empty kitchen, her heart heavy with disbelief. "He just fired the woman who saved his child's life," she whispered. The words barely made a sound, yet they carried the weight of years, years of loyalty, silence, and things left unspoken. Outside, the wind pressed against the windows, making them shudder softly. Somewhere upstairs, light spilled from under Richard's office door. He was still awake, probably reviewing numbers, contracts, profit margins, things that could be counted. But kindness, loyalty, sacrifice, those were not part of his spreadsheets. Mrs. Green rose from her chair slowly, her knees aching with age. She walked toward the kitchen window and looked out across the dark estate. The reflection of her tired eyes stared back at her, framed by streaks of rain on the glass. If only he remembered, she murmured. If only he still had a heart. She thought of Elena, walking home in the rain with her little girl, the same woman who once dove into icy water without a second thought. And she thought of Lila, that brave little child who had spoken truth to power in the middle of a storm. For the first time in years, Mrs. Green felt something stir inside her, a quiet rebellion, a flicker of justice. Maybe, she thought, it was time the truth reached Richard Hale again. Maybe it was time he remembered the kind of person Elena really was. As she turned off the kitchen light, the darkness swallowed the room, but it wasn't empty anymore. It was full of ghosts, of gratitude forgotten, of courage ignored, of a kindness the world had failed to repay. Upstairs, Richard shifted in his chair, unaware that his past, the one thing he had long buried under wealth and pride, was about to come knocking again. And in that same moment, across the city, in a small, worn-down apartment, a mother tucked her daughter into bed. Lila's hair was still damp, her cheeks flushed from the cold. "Mama," she murmured sleepily, "do you think the boss man will ever be kind?" Elena smiled faintly, brushing a strand of hair from her daughter's forehead. "Maybe one day," she whispered. "Sometimes people forget. But hearts can remember." Outside their window, the rain finally stopped. The clouds began to part, revealing a thin sliver of moonlight somewhere far away. The mansion lights still glowed, two worlds connected by one forgotten act of courage, waiting for the truth to rise again. The next morning dawned with a gray, reluctant light, the kind that barely filters through heavy clouds. The mansion, as always, was spotless and silent, but something unseen had shifted in its air. For the first time in years, Richard Hale's morning didn't begin with control. It began with confusion. He sat behind his enormous mahogany desk, surrounded by luxury, polished marble floors, expensive art, a window view that stretched beyond the city. The morning news murmured from the TV in the corner, stock reports scrolled across a screen, and the smell of fresh espresso filled the air. But none of it reached him. His mind was elsewhere. Numbers blurred into meaningless lines on the page. His hand hovered above the reports, then fell away. The world that usually made perfect sense to him, profits, contracts, control, suddenly felt hollow. All he could hear was that voice, a child's voice, small, soft yet powerful enough to echo through the cold marble of his heart. "Can you make a new rule?" The words wouldn't leave him. No matter how hard he tried to focus, they came back again and again, until the phrase began to sound like a question from his own conscience. A rule that says, kind people don't lose their jobs for small mistakes. He leaned back in his chair, Closing his eyes, the memory of the little girl's face rose uninvited, rain on her cheeks, innocence in her eyes. The way she looked at him, not with anger, but with disappointment. It stung more than any insult ever could. It should, she had said. When he told her life doesn't work that way. 2 words, simple, unpolished. But they cracked open something he had sealed away long ago. Richard opened his eyes, and for the first time, he didn't see his office. He saw the lake, a still, cold memory, water that shimmered like glass, a small hand breaking the surface, a scream, his scream, echoing in his ears. The scene unfolded in his mind like an old film, grainy and distant yet painfully vivid. He saw himself younger, desperate. Standing at the edge of the water, he saw the chaos, servants yelling, people running, no one knowing what to do, and then he saw her, Elena, barefoot, drenched, trembling, but fearless. She had jumped without hesitation, pulling his daughter out with shaking arms. Gasping for breath but refusing to let go until Clara was safe, he remembered that day, the sound of Clara's cough when she finally breathed again, the relief that had crashed over him like a wave. But most of all, he remembered what he didn't do. He never thanked her, not properly, not sincerely. He had told himself it was fine, that a bonus in her paycheck was enough, that words weren't necessary. But sitting there now, surrounded by everything money could buy, he realized how little that meant. He had fired the woman who once saved his child's life, over coffee, over a moment of human imperfection. The thought hit him so hard that he stood abruptly, the chair scraping across the floor. His chest felt tight, his pulse quickened. The arrogance, the blindness, it all came rushing in at once. "What have I done?" he whispered. The assistant outside his office jumped when he called her name. She hurried in, tablet in hand, her usual professional calm faltering when she saw the look on his face. "Sir?" "Find her," Richard said, his voice low but urgent. "Her name's Elena. She used to work here." The assistant hesitated. "Yesterday's termination file?" "Yes, sir. But she didn't leave an address?" "Just a phone number that doesn't connect." "Then find another way." The sharpness of his tone startled even him. He softened. "Please." The assistant blinked. Please was not a word she was used to hearing from him. "I'll see what I can do." "Sir?" She turned to leave, but he stopped her. "Check with Mrs. Green. She might know." As the door closed, Richard sank back into his chair. His reflection in the glass wall looked older, smaller, like a man seeing himself for the first time, stripped of pride and armor. He stared at his hands, the same hands that signed contracts worth millions, that controlled lives with a single decision, and yet those same hands had written Elena's dismissal, coldly, without thought. His assistant's voice buzzed faintly from the intercom a few minutes later. "Sir, Mrs. Green is on her way up." Richard rubbed his temples, trying to calm the storm inside him. But when the door opened and the old housekeeper entered, something in her eyes told him she already knew what this was about. She stood silently for a moment, her expression unreadable. Then she said quietly, "You remember, don't you?" Richard looked up sharply. "The lake, Clara," Mrs. Green nodded. "I was there. I saw what she did." Her tone wasn't angry, It was sad, almost weary. The kind of sadness that comes from watching someone forget what matters most. "She didn't think twice, sir. She just jumped. Most people would have frozen. You could have lost your daughter that day." Richard's throat tightened. I didn't know it was her." "You did once," Mrs. Green said softly. "You just stopped remembering." The words landed like a blow. All his justifications, his strictness, his discipline, his rules, suddenly felt meaningless. He had built an empire of control, but somewhere along the way he had lost compassion. "Where is she now?" he asked. Mrs. Green hesitated. "She doesn't live far, I think. A small apartment near the old district. She never complained about the pay, you know. Said as long as she could take care of her little girl, she was grateful." Her voice trembled on the word grateful. It felt wrong that someone who had given so much expected so little. Richard stood again, determination flickering in his eyes. "I need to see her," he said. Today Mrs. Green nodded slowly, but her gaze stayed on him. "Then go with humility, sir. Don't bring your wallet, bring your heart." For a long moment Richard said nothing. Then, quietly, he whispered, "It's been a long time since I used that." As Mrs. Green left, the office felt unbearably quiet again. But this time it wasn't empty. It was heavy with purpose. Richard looked out the window at the gray city skyline. For years he had ruled it with precision and pride. But now, for the first time, he felt like a man standing at the edge of something far greater than business, redemption. The clouds outside began to shift, letting in a sliver of sunlight that landed across his desk. He reached for his coat, his movements unsteady but certain. The sound of his footsteps echoed through the hall as he left his office. Not as a billionaire giving orders, but as a man chasing forgiveness, and somewhere across that sprawling city, in a cramped apartment that smelled faintly of rain and soap, a woman sat quietly sewing a torn school uniform. Her daughter laughed in the background. Playing with paper boats near the window, neither of them knew that the man they least expected was already on his way, carrying guilt, memory, and a heart he was finally ready to use again. He spent the entire morning trying to find her, every name, every number, every person who might have remembered. He called them all. His voice, once firm and commanding, sounded different now, uncertain, almost pleading. "Do you remember Elena? The maid? She worked here for years." Most didn't. Some hesitated, searching their memory, and then replied with a tone that carried quiet shame. "I think I remember her face. She was kind, wasn't she?" All was smiling, yet not one of them could recall her full name. Not one. The woman who had served them, helped them, smiled at them for half a decade, and they didn't even know her last name. It struck him then how invisible she must have felt, how people could pass through rooms, serve clean and vanish without ever being truly seen. For years, he'd lived surrounded by staff who obeyed his every command. Yet none of them had ever spoken to him. Not really. And he had never listened. That realization was heavier than guilt. It was truth, sharp and merciless. Finally, late in the afternoon, Mrs. Green appeared at his office door. She carried a thin, weathered file pressed against her chest, as if it were something sacred. "Sir," she said quietly, "I found something." Her employment file. One of the old ones. Her voice was soft, but her eyes told him what she didn't say, aloud. "You should have remembered without this." He took the file with trembling hands. Inside, just a few sheets of paper, her handwriting neat, her address written carefully in blue ink. Maple Street, apartment 2B. There was also a small ID photo clipped to the corner, a younger Elena, smiling faintly. She looked tired but kind. He stared at that picture for a long time. It was the first time in years he truly looked at her. "Maple Street," he murmured. Mrs. Green nodded. "Near the station. Small building, old side of town." He didn't say another word. He just stood, slipped on his coat, and left the mansion. The city outside was alive, horns blaring, crowds moving, lights flickering across rain-soaked streets. But for Richard, it all blurred into a distant hum. His car engine roared to life, and the world around him became a stream of colors. Gold, red, gray. He drove without music, without words, just the rhythm of his heartbeat, and the whisper of rain against glass. For the first time in years, he felt something he couldn't name. It wasn't anger. It wasn't even guilt anymore. It was smallness, the kind of humility that strips away layers of pride until only a man remains. Vulnerable, raw, exposed. His reflection in the rearview mirror didn't look like a billionaire. It looked like a man haunted by memory, the weight of choices too easily made. The windshield wipers swept away the rain in rhythmic waves, revealing streets he hadn't driven through in decades. Once, he had known this part of the city, before the business towers, before the private chauffeurs, before his world became marble and glass. The buildings here were old, walls cracked, windows fogged. Street vendors stood beneath umbrellas, selling roasted peanuts, umbrellas, and steaming tea. Children darted between puddles, laughing as if the rain was their playground. And for a fleeting second he envied them, their simplicity, their freedom from the suffocating perfection he'd built his life around. The car slowed as he turned onto Maple Street. The road was narrow, uneven. Water pooled in potholes, reflecting faint neon lights from the small shops lining the sidewalks. Laundry hung from balconies. A dog barked in the distance. The air smelled of rain, smoke, and life. Richard rolled down the window slightly, breathing it in. It was rough, unfiltered, but real. He hadn't felt real in a long time. Parking near the curb, he stepped out into the drizzle. His polished shoes splashed in a puddle, staining the black leather. He didn't care. The building in front of him was small, paint peeling from the walls. The sign above the entrance was faded, letters barely legible. A child's laughter echoed faintly from inside. He hesitated for a moment, unsure of what he would say, how he would even begin to apologize. The man who had once commanded boardrooms and silenced entire rooms with a glance now stood before a worn wooden door, unable to lift his hand to knock. He thought of Elena, the day he fired her, the way her voice broke when she said, "I have a daughter." He thought of Lila's eyes, innocent yet fearless, the way she had said, "It should," and suddenly, the world that once seemed predictable now felt unbearably heavy with meaning. He reached into his coat pocket, taking out his handkerchief, not to wipe rain but to steady his shaking hands. For the first time, he wasn't thinking about what people might think, or how this would look if the press found out. He was thinking about right and wrong, about gratitude and kindness, about how easily a powerful man can lose sight of both. A woman carrying groceries passed by and looked at him curiously. Well-dressed man standing uncertainly in front of an old apartment block. He gave a faint, awkward smile and nodded. She smiled back, a small, knowing look, as if she had seen this kind of reckoning before. Richard took a deep breath, and finally he climbed the narrow staircase, each creaking step echoing like a confession. The corridor smelled faintly of detergent and rain-soaked cement. Doors lined the hallway, old, dented, painted in mismatched colors. Somewhere, a radio played softly, an old love song, slightly out of tune. He stopped at apartment 2B. The number was written by hand in chalk, the door handle slightly loose. From inside, he could hear soft humming. A woman's voice, gentle, tired, comforting. He closed his eyes for a second, and in that moment, all the walls he'd built, power, pride, perfection, felt meaningless. What mattered now was 3 words he had forgotten how to say. "I'm sorry." He raised his hand and knocked. Once, softly. No answer. He waited, then knocked again. The humming stopped. Footsteps approached, light and hesitant. The door creaked open, and there she was. Elena, her hair tied loosely, her face pale with surprise. Her eyes widened as she saw him, the man who had fired her, standing soaked in the hallway of her modest home. For a second, neither of them spoke. The rain whispered behind him. The radio hummed faintly inside, and then, softly, she said, "Sir?" He swallowed hard. "Elena, I need to talk to you." His voice broke slightly, the voice that once ordered, commanded, dismissed. She looked uncertain, her hand still on the doorknob. "Please," he said quietly. "Just a few minutes." Behind her, a small head peeked from around the corner. Lila, her eyes wide, her smile hesitant. Recognition flickered there, and a hint of compassion. Even for him, for the first time in his life, Richard Hale didn't feel like a master standing before a servant. He felt like a man asking forgiveness from a woman who had already given him more than he deserved. And as he stepped through the doorway into their small, warm home filled with the scent of soup and rain, he realized that this wasn't a visit. It was the beginning of redemption. The rain hadn't stopped all evening. It fell in steady silver sheets, turning the streets into rivers of reflected light. Inside the small apartment on Maple Street, the warmth of a flickering lamp painted gentle gold across cracked walls and faded wallpaper. The gut smell of soup simmering on a small stove filled the air, the kind of comfort that money could never buy. Lena stood by the window, her hands still damp from washing dishes. She could hear the rhythm of the rain against the glass. Soft, constant, familiar. Leela sat at the small table behind her, coloring with broken crayons, humming a tune that only children know. For the first time in days, their little home felt peaceful again. Perfect. Not easy, but peaceful. And then A sound. A knock. Gentle, hesitant, unlike the loud ones of debt collectors or neighbors. It was a knock that carried something else. Uncertainty. Maybe guilt. Maybe both. Elena wiped her hands on her apron and walked to the door. She opened it and froze. Standing there in the rain-soaked hallway was Richard Hale, the man who once seemed untouchable, the man whose house gleamed with gold and silence, now stood before her drenched to the bone, his coat heavy with rain, his hat clutched tightly in his hand. His hair was wet, his shoulders slightly hunched, the posture of a man who had finally remembered what humility felt like. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The rain filled the silence, echoing faintly through the corridor. Then, softly, she whispered, "Mr. Hale?" He nodded once, his voice trembling just enough to betray the storm inside him. "Elena," he began, and then stopped, as if the words he had come to say had suddenly become too heavy. She waited, quiet, her eyes uncertain but kind, and then he said it, the words no one ever expected to hear from Richard Hale. "I came to say I'm sorry." The words hung there, fragile and sincere. The same mouth that once barked orders now spoke like a man confessing to himself. Elena blinked, unsure she had heard right. Her hands fidgeted against her apron. "You don't owe me anything, sir," she said quietly. Her tone was steady, but her eyes betrayed confusion, as if the ground beneath the years of injustice had suddenly shifted. Richard shook his head slowly, rain dripping from his hair. His voice cracked. "No, I owe you everything." His throat tightened as he continued. "You saved my daughter's life years ago. At the lake. Do you remember?" Her breath caught. Of course she remembered. Every detail burned into memory. The cold water. The child's terrified scream. Her own body shivering as she dragged the girl to shore. But she had never spoken of it. Not once. To her, it wasn't a story to tell. It was something any decent person would have done. "I remember," she whispered. Her eyes glistened, not with pride, but with a quiet sorrow. She was so small. "I just did what I had to." Richard's gaze dropped to the floor. "And I treated you like you were nothing. I fired you like you were disposable. And all this time I never realized. You were the one person who showed me what humanity looked like." The words cracked as they left him, every syllable breaking a piece of the arrogance he'd built around himself for decades. For a man used to commanding rooms. Apologizing felt like climbing a mountain barefoot. But this was his redemption. Elena's lips trembled, but she stayed silent. What could she say? That it was all right? That it didn't matter? It did matter. It had broken her. But seeing him now, drenched, remorseful, human, softened something inside her she didn't know was still capable of softness. She took a slow breath, and the tension in the room eased just slightly. Then, from behind her, a small voice spoke. "Mama." Richard looked up. From the corner of the room, Lila peeked out, her hair a little messy, her small hands clutching her coloring pencil, her eyes, bright and curious, flicked between her mother and the man at the door. "Mama," she whispered again, "is that the boss man?" Elena turned, forcing a soft smile. "Yes, sweetheart." Lila stepped closer, her bare feet patting softly on the old wooden floor. "Did he make a new rule yet?" The question hung in the air, simple, pure, and powerful enough to make the world pause. Richard stared at her. The same little girl whose words had echoed in his mind for days. Her voice was small, but her truth was enormous. He felt his throat tighten, his eyes sting. Slowly, a faint, trembling smile spread across his face, the first real smile he'd given in years. "He did," Richard said softly, voice heavy with emotion. He crouched slightly, lowering himself to her level, a man who had once stood above everyone, now humbling himself before a child. "And it's a very good one." Lila tilted her head, curious. "What is it?" He looked at her, really looked, and spoke the words as if sealing a vow. "The new rule is, no good heart goes unnoticed again." The rain softened outside, almost as if the world itself had taken a breath. Elena's hand came up to her mouth. Tears finally falling, quiet, uncontrollable. "Beautiful." Lila smiled, that small, innocent smile that could disarm any pain, and in that tiny apartment, something extraordinary happened. Pride bowed to kindness, power bowed to humility, and forgiveness, quiet and undeserved, filled the space between them. Richard looked around the modest home, the worn furniture, the chipped cups, the drawings taped to the wall. He had spent his life surrounded by luxury, but never once had a room felt this full. There was no chandelier, no marble, no gold trim, only warmth, and for the first time, he envied it, Elena, he said after a long pause, his voice softer than she'd ever heard it. If you'll allow it, I'd like to make things right. You don't owe me anything. I owe you my gratitude, and my daughter owes you her life. She shook her head slowly, her expression calm, maternal. Mr. Hale, you already did. You came back. The simplicity of her words broke him completely. He lowered his head, his shoulders trembling, not from cold, but from release. Leela, watching quietly, stepped forward and handed him one of her crayons. Here, she said innocently, for your new rule. So you don't forget to write it down. Richard took it, a small blue crayon, and looked at it as though it were something priceless. Thank you, Lila, he whispered. In that moment, something shifted inside him, something permanent. The man who once measured life in profit and perfection now understood that value was never in things, it was in people. The rain began to ease, the steady rhythm fading to a gentle patter. He stood there a while longer, not as a billionaire, not as a boss, but as a man forgiven. When he finally turned to leave, Elena placed a hand over her heart and said quietly, "Tell your daughter I said hello." He paused at the door and nodded. "She remembers you," he said softly. "I told her the story." "Good." Elena smiled faintly. "Then maybe she'll grow up to be kind." Richard met her gaze. And for the first time, they stood as equals. "She already is," he said, as he stepped back into the rain. It no longer felt cold. The storm that had started with a forgotten cup of coffee had ended with something far greater, a moment of grace. Behind him, in that little apartment, laughter returned, small, fragile, but real, and as Richard walked away down the wet, glimmering street, he realized that the world hadn't changed. He had. Sometimes, redemption doesn't come in grand gestures or dramatic apologies. Sometimes it comes in the form of a little girl, asking a simple question. The storm had quieted, but the sound of rain still lingered in the air, soft, distant, like the echo of a confession finally spoken. Inside the small apartment, silence wrapped around the three of them, Elena, Lila, and Richard. Each caught in the fragile stillness that comes after truth. Richard stood by the door, his coat dripping onto the old floorboards, his hands clenched slightly, not from anger, but from the weight of the moment. He had come here with guilt. But standing in front of Elena now, seeing the way she held her daughter close with dignity and calm, he felt something else rising inside him, something rare, something long forgotten. Respect. His voice, when it came, was steady yet softer than it had ever been. "I didn't come to give charity," he began, his words measured, sincere. "I came to give respect." The words seemed to hang in the air, wrapping themselves around the little room like a quiet promise. Elena looked up, startled. Respect. It was not a word she was used to hearing from the man who once measured people by their usefulness. She frowned slightly, not out of anger, but confusion. "Respect?" she repeated softly, her voice barely above a whisper. Richard nodded, taking a slow step forward, as though approaching something sacred. "You're not a maid, Elena. You never were. Your family." The word family struck her like a distant echo of a life she had long stopped dreaming about. Family wasn't something people in her position heard from men like him. It was something she gave, not something she received. She blinked, uncertain. "Family?" Richard's eyes softened. "Yes, you've been in that house longer than anyone. You kept it running when others quit. You made it a home when it was just a mansion of walls, and you saved what mattered most to me, my daughter." His throat tightened, emotion pressing through every word. "If you're willing, I want you to come back," he said, his voice trembling slightly. "Not as a servant, but as the head of household. You'll manage everything. The staff, the property, the operations. The house needs a heart again." And I can't think of anyone better." For a long moment, Elena didn't move. She just stood there staring at him. The man who had once dismissed her without a second thought, now standing before her, offering her not pity, not payment, but purpose. Her lips parted slightly, her voice unsteady. "Sir, I don't know if I can—" Richard shook his head before she could finish. "You already did," he said softly. He gave a faint, humble smile. "You've managed to remind me what kind of man I used to be." There was a long silence after that, a silence not of awkwardness, but of healing. The kind that follows when hearts finally begin to understand each other. Elena's eyes glistened, her composure breaking. For years she had worked in silence, her kindness unseen, her sacrifices unnoticed. And now the same man who had once ignored her humanity stood before her, not as her employer, but as a man seeking forgiveness. Behind her, Lila peeked from her chair, her tiny hands wrapped around her coloring book. She watched them both with that quiet wisdom that only children possess, the ability to see love even when it's hidden beneath layers of pride. Then she smiled, a small, radiant smile that cut through the heaviness like morning light through fog. "Told you." "Mama," she whispered proudly, tugging at her mother's sleeve. "My rule works." Richard turned toward her, and for the first time in years, a laugh escaped his lips. Real, unguarded, warm. It wasn't the polished, polite laugh of a businessman, but the deep, human laugh of a man who finally remembered how it felt to breathe without a mask. "It does. Little one," he said, his voice softening even more. "It truly does." Lila giggled, the sound pure and infectious. She reached up and held out her hand. Richard looked at it, a small, muddy, innocent hand, and without hesitation, he took it. It was the simplest gesture, but it carried the weight of redemption. In that small apartment, surrounded by cracked walls and flickering light, something sacred happened. A bridge formed between two worlds, one built on wealth and power, and the other on humility and love. Elena looked at them both, her little girl's joy, and the man who once seemed made of stone now smiling like a father rediscovering hope. And she felt her heart swell with something too large to name. Gratitude, relief, forgiveness, maybe. All of them at once. She stepped closer, her voice trembling but firm. "Mr. Hale, He gently raised a hand to stop her. "No more Mr. Hale, please." "Just Richard." The informality startled her for a moment. It was as if he was handing her equality, not just a new title. "All right," she said softly. "Richard?" The name felt strange in her mouth, but strangely freeing. "If I come back," she continued after a pause, "I want to do it right. I want to make sure the staff are treated fairly, that the kitchen girls get proper hours, and that no one ever feels like they're less than anyone else again." Richard nodded, a quiet smile on his lips. "That's exactly why I need you back." The sincerity in his tone was unmistakable. He wasn't trying to fix his reputation. He was trying to fix himself. Leela, still listening, leaned her chin on her hands. "Mama," she said in a small, thoughtful voice, "does that mean we can live in the big house again?" Elena looked down, brushing a lock of hair from her daughter's forehead. "Maybe, sweetheart, but only if the big house has a big heart now." Richard's chest tightened again, this time not with guilt, but with emotion. "It will," he said firmly. "From now on, it will." Outside, the rain began to ease into a drizzle, as if the world itself was exhaling, washing away the last of the bitterness that had clung to their lives. The three of them stood there in the quiet, not as employer and employee, not as the rich and the poor, but as people who had finally understood one another. Richard took a slow breath and said, "I'll have the papers drawn up tomorrow. But please, take your time. Think about it. I just wanted you to know the door is open. And it always will be." Elena's eyes softened, her voice steady now. "Thank you, Richard, for remembering that hearts matter more than rules." He smiled faintly, the corner of his lips trembling. "It was your daughter who reminded me," he said, glancing at Lila. "Sometimes it takes a child to teach adults what's truly important." Lila grinned, proud and playful. "Then you better listen carefully next time." Richard laughed again, that genuine laugh that seemed to cleanse the air around them. "I will, Lila, I promise." And for the first time in years, Richard Hale, the man whose name once commanded fear and respect, felt something greater than either. He felt peace. As he stepped back toward the door, he looked once more at the small apartment, humble, warm, alive, and realized something extraordinary. The richest place he'd ever stood wasn't his mansion. It was here. "Good night, Elena," he said quietly. "Good night, little one. Good night, boss man," Lila replied cheerfully. Or should I say, new rule man? He smiled at that, a deep fatherly smile that would stay with him for the rest of his life. "I like that better," he said softly. "Good night, new rule girl." And with that, he stepped back into the cool night air, lighter, freer, transformed. The rain had stopped completely now. The sky above the city was clearing, streaks of moonlight breaking through the clouds. As he walked toward his car, the faint sound of laughter from the apartment followed him. The sound of a mother and daughter finally safe, finally hopeful, and for the first time in his life, Richard Hale understood that forgiveness doesn't erase the past, it redeems it. He looked up at the night sky and whispered to himself, almost in disbelief, her rule really did change everything. Days passed quietly, like a slow sunrise breaking through the clouds of an old storm. The mansion on the hill, once a place of perfection and fear, began to breathe again. Its long hallways, which had echoed with footsteps and orders, now carried something else entirely: laughter. The kind of laughter that came not from duty, but from joy. In the grand kitchen, where whispers used to replace conversation, the clinking of dishes mixed with soft music. Someone hummed a tune while washing plates. Someone else giggled while kneading dough. The smell of fresh bread filled the air, simple, warm, human, and at the center of it all was a man once thought incapable of warmth. Richard Hale, the man who once spoke only to correct, who measured value in results and worth in obedience, now began his mornings differently. Not with the sound of orders, but with the sound of voices. He walked into rooms not to inspect, but to greet. He spoke names, first names, that had once been invisible to him. "Good morning, Thomas," he would say to the gardener. "How's your boy doing in school?" Or to the cook, smiling softly, "Those biscuits smell better than any boardroom breakfast I've ever had." At first, the staff didn't know how to react. Years of caution had built invisible walls around them, walls that whispered, "Don't speak unless spoken to." But slowly, one by one, those walls began to crumble. A smile answered a question. A laugh followed a joke. And suddenly, the mansion, that vast, beautiful, lonely house, became a home. There were moments of quiet, too. Moments when Richard would stand in the empty dining hall, sunlight pouring through tall glass windows, and remember the way things had been, the gold-trimmed plates, the flawless meals, the silence that felt like power, and the loneliness that came with it. He would glance at the head of the table, the same place where he had once scolded Elena for a missing cup of coffee, and he'd feel a pang of shame mixed with gratitude. Now sometimes he poured his own coffee. He didn't announce it or make it symbolic. He simply did it, quietly. It wasn't an act of humility for show, but a silent acknowledgement of what pride had once cost him. The first time he did it, one of the young maids gasped, dropping a towel. "Sir, let me do that," she'd said, flustered. But Richard had only smiled, his voice kind. "It's all right, Anna. I can manage." The way he said it, softly, genuinely, made her pause. She'd never heard her name spoken by him before. Not once, after that day, something shifted even deeper. It wasn't just the atmosphere. It was the feeling of being seen, of mattering. Elena, now the head of household, walked through the halls with quiet pride. Her posture, once careful and restrained, carried confidence now. She wasn't afraid to speak. She gave instructions with grace, listened with patience, and made sure everyone's needs were met. The mansion ran smoother than it ever had, not through fear, but through respect, and every time Richard passed her in the corridor, he nodded politely, a smile touching his face, a silent thank you for reminding him that leadership wasn't about control. It was about care. In the evenings, the mansion didn't fall silent as it used to. The staff didn't rush home in fear or exhaustion. They lingered a bit longer, sharing tea in the kitchen, sometimes even playing soft music on the old radio. Richard would walk by, pretending not to listen, but he'd pause near the doorway, his lips curving in quiet amusement as the faint sound of laughter reached him. Once, he overheard a voice, a young gardener teasingly whispering, "Look who's smiling now. The boss man's gone soft." Richard didn't scold him. Instead, he chuckled to himself and walked away, because they were right. He had gone soft, but in the best way possible. It didn't take long before the nickname started spreading, Mr. Hale with a heart. At first, he laughed it off. But one morning, as he walked past two housekeepers dusting the stair rails, he heard one of them whisper it with a smile. And this time, it made his chest tighten in a way he didn't expect. Mr. Hale with a heart. He thought about the irony, how he'd spent years chasing success, control, and reputation, only to realize that the greatest title he'd ever earned came not from power, but compassion. That night, after dinner, he found himself standing by the window overlooking the garden. The air was crisp, the scent of wet grass rising from below. He could hear faint laughter echoing from the servants' quarters, soft and unrestrained. For years he would have considered that noise unprofessional. Now it sounded like life returning to the walls. "Feels different, doesn't it?" came Elena's voice from behind him. He turned, surprised to find her standing there, her hands folded neatly, her expression calm, yet warm. "It does," he said quietly. "For once it feels alive," she nodded. "That's what kindness does, sir," he smiled faintly. "You can call me Richard, remember?" Helena smiled back. Old habits die hard. They both laughed, a soft, genuine laugh that filled the silence comfortably. After she left, he looked back out the window, his reflection merging with the night beyond. He saw a man transformed, not by success, not by wealth, but by humility and gratitude. Somewhere deep inside, he thought about his daughter Clara, how she had grown, how she had been saved by the very woman he'd once fired. He made a silent vow that night that his daughter would grow up not just knowing the value of hard work, but the importance of heart. The following morning, something new appeared on the kitchen notice board, a small white sheet of paper, neatly pinned. No one knew who had written it, but everyone had a guess. It read, "Rule Number 1. Kind people don't lose their jobs for small mistakes." Underneath, someone had drawn a tiny smiley face, and at the bottom, written in a child's uneven handwriting, "Approved by Lila." When Richard saw it later that day, he stopped in his tracks. His lips trembled as he read the words, the same rule that had once come from the mouth of a little girl standing in the rain, holding her mother's hand. That small, simple truth had changed everything. He didn't remove the note. He didn't correct the handwriting or make it formal. He left it there, untouched. Every time he walked past it, he smiled. Every staff member who read it felt a quiet warmth bloom in their chest. It became more than a note. It became a philosophy, the Hale Mansion rule, a rule born from kindness, a rule that reminded everyone, every day, that empathy was not weakness, it was strength. And so, the mansion thrived, the gardens bloomed brighter, the halls rang with life, and the man who once measured time in profit now measured it in smiles. One evening, as the sun dipped low, painting the sky with gold and rose, Richard walked into the dining hall, in the same hall that had once been a place of judgment. He stood by the table, the faint smell of coffee rising from the cup in his hands. He smiled to himself and murmured quietly, "Everything on time, as it should be." But this time, the words meant something different. They weren't about control. They were about peace. For the first time in his life, Richard Hale understood that true wealth wasn't the mansion he owned. It was the home he'd finally built inside it. The morning was bright, golden, and gentle, the kind of morning that seemed to bless everything it touched. The lake shimmered under the sunlight, calm and endless, as if holding the memories of everything that had ever happened there. Years ago, it had been the place of loss, of regret, the site of a man's breakdown and a woman's compassion. Today, it was different. Today it was peace. Richard Hale stood by the water's edge, watching the ripples move like soft music across the surface. His reflection stared back. Older now, gentler. His eyes no longer sharp with command, but softened by something far greater: gratitude. Behind him, the laughter of children rose like birdsong. Clara, now 12, bright and confident, was chasing Lila through the grass. The two girls ran barefoot, their dresses fluttering in the breeze, their laughter echoing across the water. Each giggle felt like sunlight breaking through clouds. Elena sat nearby unpacking a basket. The smell of homemade food, bread, roasted chicken, and apple tarts filled the air. She arranged the dishes carefully on a checkered blanket, every movement calm and purposeful, her hand steady with quiet grace. When Richard turned toward her, he smiled, not the polite smile of a businessman, but the honest, unguarded smile of a man at peace. It had been years since they'd all sat together like this, free of formality, free of distance. "I can't remember the last time I had a picnic," he said lightly, settling down beside her. "That's because you used to think picnics were a waste of time," Elena teased gently. He chuckled, nodding. "I suppose I did. Strange how life proves us wrong in the most beautiful ways." From the distance, Clara called out, "Dad! Look, Lila taught me how to skip stones." Richard turned his head, watching as both girls knelt by the edge of the lake, tossing small, flat stones that danced across the water's surface before sinking into stillness. 7 skips. Lila shouted proudly, "No fair!" Clara laughed. "I only got 3. "You'll get better," Lila said, her eyes bright with the same kindness her mother had always carried. The sound of their laughter reached Richard's ears, and something inside him stirred, that fragile, tender feeling that always came when he saw innocence untouched by the world's weight. He leaned back, his hands behind him, watching the 2 children, one the daughter of a man who once lost his way, the other the daughter of the woman who helped him find it again. Elena noticed the faraway look in his eyes. "You're thinking again," she said softly, pouring him a cup of tea. "Guilty," he admitted with a faint smile. "I was just remembering how different this place feels now." She glanced toward the lake, the sunlight glinting off its surface. "It's amazing what forgiveness can do. It changes the same place into something entirely new." He nodded slowly, his gaze never leaving the water. "You know, Elena, I used to come here to escape people, to be alone with my thoughts, but today I don't want to be alone at all." Elena smiled faintly. "Then don't be." "You're not." There was a moment of comfortable silence between them, the kind of silence that spoke volumes. It wasn't awkward or heavy. It was shared peace, the quiet understanding between 2 people who had walked through fire and found the other side. Clara ran up then, her face glowing with joy and sweat. She threw her arms around Lila and pulled her toward Richard. "Daddy, guess what? Lila says her mom used to work for us. Isn't that funny?" Richard's smile deepened. "Funny?" he echoed softly. "Yes, I suppose it is," Lila giggled, tugging at her mother's hand. "Mama, tell him what I said earlier." Elena raised an eyebrow, laughing lightly. "Oh, no, you tell him. You're much better at storytelling." Lila stood proudly, her little chin tilted up. "I told Clara that my mama saved her dad." Clara gasped, her eyes wide. "You did?" "Uh-huh. But then Mama said I'm wrong. She said he saved us." Both girls giggled again, their innocence stitching together 2 pasts that had once been broken. Richard looked at Elena, his eyes glistening, voice soft. "You gave me back my family," he said. She met his gaze gently, her expression calm, her heart full. "No, sir. You just remembered what family means." For a long moment Richard said nothing. He simply looked out at the lake, at the 2 girls sitting together on the grass, their laughter mixing with the whisper of the breeze. The world felt whole again, as if the lake itself had forgiven them all. "I used to think legacy was about names carved into marble," he murmured. "About what we leave behind in buildings and companies." He looked at Clara, her hands covered in dirt, her laughter unrestrained. "But it's not that, is it?" Elena shook her head softly. "No, legacy is what you leave inside the people who remember you." He nodded slowly. The truth sinking in like sunlight through water, every act of kindness, every apology, every shared meal. It had all led to this, to laughter by the lake, to peace. "Do you ever think," he asked quietly, "that maybe we were all meant to end up here? That day, when you brought me coffee, when I let anger win, maybe it was never a mistake." "Maybe it was the beginning," Elena smiled, her eyes gentle. "Maybe the universe gives us storms so we can appreciate the calm." The girls' laughter grew louder. They had started a race now, splashing barefoot in the shallows, their reflections dancing on the surface. "Careful!" Elena called out, but her voice was full of laughter too. Richard watched them, his chest rising and falling slowly. "They're going to be fine," he said quietly. "Better than we ever were, because they'll grow up knowing love before pride," Elena replied. A bird soared overhead, its wings cutting through the golden sky. The breeze shifted, carrying the sound of the girls' laughter farther out across the lake, as if the world itself was listening. "You know," Richard said after a while, "when Clara was little, I thought love was protection. I thought it meant shielding her from everything, mistakes, pain, imperfection. But maybe love is the opposite. Maybe it's teaching her how to heal when life breaks things." Elena looked at him with quiet admiration. "That's what being a father means," he smiled faintly. "And what being a mother means, too." The afternoon stretched into golden evening. The shadows lengthened, the air cooled, and the light turned soft and honey-colored. Clara and Lila sat side by side now, sharing a sandwich, whispering secrets only children could understand. Their laughter came in small bursts, gentle and pure. Elena began packing up, her movements unhurried. Richard helped her fold the blanket, their hands brushing briefly, a touch so simple, yet filled with years of unspoken gratitude. "You ever think about working less?" she asked teasingly. He smiled. "I am. One day at a time." "That's good," she said. "You deserve rest." He glanced at her with warmth. "So do you." They shared a quiet smile, one that didn't need words. As they prepared to leave, Richard took one last look at the lake, the place where his life had shattered, and where it had been mended again. The water glistened, calm and endless, like forgiveness itself. Lila waved at him, calling, "Bye, Mr. Hale with a heart." He laughed softly, shaking his head. "Still that nickname, huh?" Elena smiled. "It suits you." "Maybe it does," he said, looking back at the lake. "Maybe it always should have." The sun dipped lower, painting the world in gold. Two families, once strangers, now bound by something stronger than circumstance, walked together toward the horizon, and as they disappeared up the hill, the lake shimmered behind them, holding their reflections like a secret, a memory of grace, redemption, and love rediscovered. The sun was slipping gently behind the lake, its light melting into shades of orange, rose, and gold. The air was still, the water calm, and the world seemed to hold its breath, as if waiting for something sacred to be said. Richard stood at the edge of the shore, his shoes half sunk in the damp sand. The cool evening breeze brushed against his face, carrying the faint scent of pine and water. His coat fluttered softly, and for a long while he didn't move. He just stared at the reflection of the sky rippling across the surface, at the faint glimmer of stars beginning to wake, at the same lake that had once nearly taken his daughter's life, and had since given him back his own. Behind him, the picnic had ended hours ago. The laughter had faded. Clara and Lila were asleep in the car, and Elena was tidying up the last of the baskets. But Richard lingered, unable to leave. Something inside him needed this moment, one last quiet conversation with his past. He closed his eyes, the whisper of memory flooding back. The echo of his own voice, cold, commanding, years of orders, firings, demands, dismissals. He remembered the faces of people he'd walked past without truly seeing, the ones who had built his empire, cleaned his home, carried his world on their shoulders, all while he never stopped long enough to say thank you. He took a deep breath, exhaling slowly. The sound of the wind over the water seemed to answer him, soft and patient, like forgiveness itself. How many people did I step over, he thought aloud, just to stand taller? His reflection trembled on the lake's surface, the lines of age, the eyes heavy with years of pride, softened now with something almost tender. How many hearts did I mistake for hands? He looked up at the horizon, where the last light touched the clouds, and then he thought of her. The maid he fired over a cup of coffee, the woman who once jumped into a frozen lake to save his child without a second's hesitation. The same woman who, even after being humiliated, had found it in her heart to forgive him, Elena. Her name carried warmth now, not guilt. Gratitude, not shame. She had become the quiet compass that pointed him back toward humanity. Then his thoughts drifted to Leela, that small, fearless child who had stood at his gate in the rain, looking up at him with nothing but courage and honesty. "Can you make a new rule?" she had asked. He smiled faintly, whispering into the breeze. "Yes, little one." "I did." The water shimmered as the first star appeared above it, reflected perfectly in the dark mirror below. "Kindness isn't weakness," he murmured softly. "It's wealth." The words seemed to echo around him, not loud, but steady, like truth spoken from the soul. He repeated them again, slower this time, tasting the weight of every syllable. "Kindness isn't weakness. It's wealth." He looked down at his reflection again. For the first time in years, he didn't see the billionaire, the tycoon, the man feared by his employees. He saw a father, a friend, a man capable of love and of change. The years ahead felt different now, no longer measured in profits or power, but in something deeper. Moments shared, lives touched, hearts mended. He smiled faintly, his voice almost a whisper to himself. Maybe that little girl was my teacher all along. The wind stirred again, brushing over the lake's surface, creating ripples that spread outward, gentle waves that carried the reflection of the sunset far and wide. To anyone else, it was just water. But to Richard, it was life itself, ever-changing, never still, always capable of beginning again. Behind him, Elena called softly, "Mr. Hale?" "It's getting late." He turned, his expression peaceful. "Just a minute." He watched as she stood near the car, the soft glow of headlights outlining her silhouette, her hair moving with the wind, her hands tucking a blanket around the sleeping girls. A vision of quiet strength and love. Richard looked back once more at the lake, feeling the cool air fill his lungs. He wanted to remember this. Not the wealth, not the mansion, not the empire, but this moment, this stillness, this gratitude. He knelt down slightly, dipping his hand into the water. The cold shocked him for a second, sharp, real, cleansing. He let it run through his fingers, watching the ripples spread. "Thank you," he whispered, to the past, to life, to whatever force had brought them all here again. He rose, straightened his coat, and turned toward the path. Each step away from the lake felt lighter than the one before. The weight of pride, of regret, seemed to slip quietly into the earth beneath his feet. As he reached the car, Elena looked up, curious. "Everything all right?" "Everything's perfect," he said softly. "You sure?" He smiled. For the first time in a long time, he opened the door. Glancing at the two sleeping girls, Clara's arm around Lila's shoulder. "They're going to change the world one day," Elena said quietly. "They already have," Richard replied, as the car started and began rolling down the quiet road. Richard looked out the window one last time. The lake glowed faintly in the distance, a mirror of the fading sky, still holding the light long after the sun was gone. In that reflection, he saw something simple, something true. Not the face of power, not the shadow of regret, but the image of a man reborn. The city awaited him beyond the hills, the same city he once ruled with iron and indifference, now one he would serve with grace and compassion. And as night finally settled, his voice, low, certain, full of peace, carried softly through the quiet hum of the road. "Kindness isn't weakness. It's the greatest kind of strength." The words lingered in the dark like a prayer, a promise, a legacy, and somewhere deep in his heart, Richard Hale knew that from this day forward, everything would be different, not just for him, but for everyone whose lives would be touched by the man who once learned, too late, what it truly means to be human. Months passed, and the world around Richard Hale slowly began to bloom again, not through wealth, but through warmth. The mansion that once stood like a fortress of silence now felt like a home. The sound of laughter traveled down its long marble corridors. The scent of freshly baked bread floated out from the kitchen each morning. Flowers filled the gardens, planted by hands that once trembled in fear, now steady with joy. The great house, once ruled by discipline and distance, had found its heartbeat again, and at the center of this change was Elena. No longer wearing the crisp uniform of a maid, she now carried herself with quiet pride. A simple linen dress, her hair tied neatly, a small silver pin on her chest engraved with the letter H. Richard had insisted she wear it. It stands for Hail, he'd said, smiling. Because you're family now. But Elena didn't stop there. The strength that had once helped her survive had now become something larger, a purpose. With Richard's help, she started something new, the Second Chance Foundation, a small but powerful charity aimed at helping single mothers find jobs, rebuild their confidence, and stand again on their own feet. Each week, women from every corner of the city walked through the doors, some trembling, some silent, some carrying babies in their arms, all searching for hope. And Elena would greet each of them with the same warm smile, the same gentle assurance, "You're not alone anymore." It became her mission, her way of turning pain into purpose. And every time Richard visited the small office downtown, he would stand quietly by the door, watching her work, humbled by the way kindness seemed to flow so naturally from her hands. He often thought she was never meant to serve. She was always meant to lead. One afternoon, as he arrived to drop off new supplies for the foundation, a familiar voice called out from the courtyard, "Mr. Hale." He turned, and there she was, Lila, now taller, brighter, her curls bouncing as she ran toward him with the same joyful energy as ever. Her backpack hung loosely over one shoulder, filled with books and drawings. Her shoes were scuffed from playing, her smile wide enough to light up the whole street. "Still following my rule, Mr. Hale?" she teased playfully, standing with her hands on her hips. Richard chuckled, adjusting his tie like a schoolboy caught off guard. "Always," he said warmly. "Good," she replied, grinning. "Because I'm adding another one soon." "Oh, really? And what's that?" "Rule number 2, never stop smiling. It makes people think you're rich in the heart." Richard laughed, a sound so genuine it made the nearby volunteers turn and smile too. He knelt to her level, brushing a raindrop from her cheek. "Then I guess I'm the richest man in the world," he said softly. Lila giggled, proud of her own wisdom, and skipped off toward her mother. Richard watched them for a long time, Helena greeting new arrivals, Lila helping another child carry boxes of food. The late afternoon sun poured golden light across the courtyard, turning the simple brick walls into something radiant, almost sacred. It was a simple scene, but to Richard it felt more beautiful than any luxury he had ever owned. A voice inside him whispered, "This is what wealth looks like." Later that evening, as he walked back toward his car, he glanced up at the sky. It was painted in soft pastels, a gentle reminder that even endings can be beautiful beginnings. He paused by a park bench where an old man was feeding pigeons. The man looked up, recognized him, and smiled faintly. "You're Richard Hale, aren't you?" "The businessman?" Richard hesitated for a moment before replying, "I used to be." "Used to be?" The man asked with curiosity. "Now," Richard said with a soft chuckle, "I'm just someone trying to do a bit of good." The old man nodded thoughtfully, tossing another handful of crumbs. "That's better business than any other, son." Richard smiled, thanked him, and continued walking. When he reached his car, he saw a drawing taped to the window. A child's sketch, done in colored pencil, showing a big house surrounded by trees, with smiling people holding hands in front of it. At the top, written in uneven handwriting, were the words, "The Hale Home, where kindness lives." In the corner, Layla had signed her name with a small heart. Richard stood there for a long time, his eyes misting. He gently folded the paper and slipped it into his coat pocket, a treasure more valuable than any stock, contract, or deal he had ever made. When he returned to the mansion that night, he found Clara waiting for him at the piano. Did you visit Aunt Elena again? She asked with a knowing smile. I did, he said. And she's doing wonderful things, Clara nodded. She always was wonderful, Dad. You just see it now. Richard chuckled softly, sitting beside her. You sound like Lila. Maybe she's rubbing off on me, Clara said, starting to play a gentle melody. As the soft music filled the room, Richard leaned back, closing his eyes. The notes floated through the house, blending with laughter from the kitchen, with the warmth of family gathered again. He thought of his old life, the endless meetings, the sterile boardrooms, the cold applause. None of it felt real anymore. None of it mattered. What mattered was here. In the music, the smiles, the peace that finally lived within him. Outside, the lights of the city shimmered like distant stars. For the first time in a long time, Richard didn't feel above it. He felt part of it. A man who had once ruled the skyline had finally learned to walk among the people below. With gratitude, he whispered softly to himself, a private prayer, a closing chapter, and a new beginning, all in one breath. No amount of money can buy a pure heart. His eyes opened as Clara finished her song. She looked at him curiously. What did you say, Dad? He smiled. Just a lesson I'm still learning. Sweetheart. The grandfather clock chimed softly in the hall, the same one that once marked the silence of lonely mornings, now marking the rhythm of a life renewed. As the final chime faded, Richard stood and walked toward the window. The reflection that looked back at him wasn't the cold businessman the world remembered. It was a father, a friend, a man reborn through kindness. And as he gazed out into the night, where the lights of the city met the stars, one final thought drifted through his mind, clear and certain. Sometimes it takes the smallest voice to remind the richest man what truly matters. The words echoed quietly in the air, a truth eternal and pure. And somewhere beyond the mansion walls, laughter carried on the wind, the sound of new beginnings, of lives touched, of hearts forever changed, the end and the beginning. Sometimes the richest people aren't the ones with the biggest houses, but the ones who have the courage to change their hearts. Richard Hale learned that kindness costs nothing, and yet it can buy back everything we've lost, because one small voice, one little girl's truth, was enough to remind a billionaire that love is the greatest wealth of all. And if you believe the world still needs stories like this, stories that remind us to stay kind, even when it's hard, then don't just scroll away. Subscribe, stay with us, because the next story might just change the way you see life. Until then, be kind, because you never know whose heart your kindness might save next.